Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of March 10th, and this is your Monday briefing. We are 4 days away from a possible government shutdown. Mark Carney is Canada's new prime minister, and 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum go into effect. Also, the Canadian province of Ontario begins imposing 25% tariffs on electricity imports into New York, Michigan, and Minnesota.
The House is scheduled to be in session through Wednesday and the Senate through Friday before both chambers depart for a one-week recess. And it's a shortened week as Democrats head out of town for a retreat. Keeping up and trying to navigate rapid change is not easy, which is why we're glad to be speaking with Rohit Kumar today. Rohit, welcome.
Thanks for having me back.
So there is a lot going on in Washington, and we have a looming deadline for a government shutdown on Friday. Could you talk about the status of negotiations and how likely is it that we could go into a shutdown?
You know, it's interesting. So the House seems legitimately poised to do something that I don't remember House Republicans ever being able to do, which is to pass a continuing resolution just with Republican votes. So they are setting themselves on a course where Speaker Johnson has said, we're going to pass this with Republican votes only, with an assist from President Trump to sort of persuade, convince, berate, however you want to think about it, holdouts to vote yes, kind of like on the budget resolution where all but Congressman Massey voted yes on the budget resolution and got it across the finish line. Now, House Democrats have a luxury here. They can all vote no, and Republicans have it within their power to pass a bill if they can unite maybe all or all but one House Republicans. Senate Democrats do not have this luxury. There is no path through the Senate without getting 60 votes, which means at least seven Senate Democrats, say that 3 times fast, are going to have to join forces with potentially 53, although we think Rand Paul probably votes no, so maybe 52 Senate Republicans, therefore requiring 8 Democrats. So this in the Senate is where it gets a little bit more interesting. At the moment, it doesn't look like we're headed to a shutdown. Senate Democrats have not signaled they're going to link arms and all vote no, but it remains to be seen who are going to be the 8 or 10 or whatever the number ends up being who end up voting yes. Doesn't appear we're headed towards a shutdown, but 2 kind of important things have to happen. House has to actually pass this thing with all Republican votes or mostly Republican votes, or maybe a handful of House Democrats who decide that they also want to vote yes. But the real action comes in the Senate. What do Senate Democrats do? And moreover, like, do they vote and do they just slow it down? Like, this thing, best case scenario, passes the House on Tuesday. Right. It's going to require the cooperation of all 100 senators to get a final vote before the Friday deadline. So even if Democrats are not going to vote yes, do they exercise all the procedural rights that the Senate allows, which would ordinarily just drag us at least into the weekend, if not into early next week.
Rohit, we'd mentioned at the top the subject of tariffs. Could you talk a little bit about the congressional perspective on what's been going on with regard to tariffs?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's been a kind of on again, off again kind of transaction. Mm-hmm. And look, there was clearly a lot of apprehension amongst even House and Senate Republicans, Democrats, about the proposed tariffs. What do it mean for prices on consumers? How it would disrupt supply chains? You know, we have certain supply chains, autos in particular, where it's really a North American supply chain, not a U.S. Supply chain. And you're seeing the president sort of launch out there and say, we're going to do this, and then kind of dial it back. The challenge here for Congress is they can be unhappy about it. They can, sort of lobby the administration for an exclusion process. But the president has a fair bit of authority to enact these tariffs, or to impose these tariffs, not enact, but to impose these tariffs under existing statutory authority. So, there's not a ton they can do. And as we have seen repeatedly over the course of the last 5 or 6 weeks, elected House and Senate Republicans are a little bit loath, perhaps, to publicly criticize the president, in any meaningful way. With some exceptions. My former boss, Senator McCandless, has some newfound freedom. He's no longer Senate Republican leader. He's not running for re-election, so that gives him a certain set of liberties that other members might not have. But if you're thinking about running for re-election in 2026, either in the House where everyone's up or a Republican senator who's worried about a primary challenge, how you navigate this is very tricky. But what you're seeing is companies reacting, taxpayers reacting, expressing a lot of concern that is showing up through congressional communication. And it does seem to be having some effect on the way the president is approaching this, but there's definitely this whiplash kind of yo-yo effect. It is very challenging for businesses, and I have a lot of sympathy for anybody that's trying to navigate, make a business decision in this very kind of chaotic environment.
Well, another piece of legislation that I think is really hard for businesses, let's turn to the tax bill. So House Ways and Means Committee is scoping out options, including revenue offsets. So there are differences between the House and Senate. So how do they reconcile them?
So they've got a couple big questions as yet outstanding. One is, what is the baseline that they're going to use for this transaction? Is this going to be the current policy baseline where the extensions have no formal score or no official score, or the current law baseline, which is what the House used in their budget resolution, where you have to account for every penny of the extensions, either by explicitly deficit financing it, offsetting it with spending cuts, or offsetting it with additional tax increases. And so the House Ways and Means Committee is going to start this week laying out options for members. And it's going to be both the candy, here are the tax cuts we can do, and the vegetables, to keep with the analogy of here is the revenue raising offsets that we would have to consider. One that is definitely getting a lot of attention, both amongst the members and in the press, is this idea of limiting the ability of businesses to deduct their state income tax payments, or business SALT, or BASALT, as we're calling it. And this is potentially a source of significant revenue, between a couple $100 billion to several $100 billion, almost $1 trillion, depending on how broadly you go with this. But it'll be interesting to see how Republicans navigate this, because I think if you walked into a House or Senate Republican office and said, how about we raise the corporate rate by 2 or 3 points, they would say, no way, no how. But you walk into those same offices and say, how about we limit the ability of businesses to deduct their state and local income tax payments? And like, that's interesting. We should have a conversation about that. Even though economically, it is substantially the same result. The revenue the federal government would collect, for just limiting it to income taxes would be, we think, about $200 billion of revenue over a 10-year period. That's like 1.5 points, maybe a little bit more on the headline rate in terms of dollar to dollar equivalency. And, but it's interesting how on the one, no way, no how, the other, let's have a conversation. So we're starting to see taxpayers kind of mobilize on this and express a point of view and say, hey, look, you said you wouldn't raise the corporate rate. That's off the table. This is essentially the same transaction, but this is a very live fire exercise, and I'm hearing more about it. I get asked about it every day or every other day, thereabouts, because it's really starting to heat up.
Okay.
With regard to the reconciliation process and trying to get the Senate and House to agree, what's the timeline for doing that? And then how does that set up the timeline for possibly processing the actual tax bill?
There's a couple ways to think about this. Absent debt limit, which I'll come back to, using the fiscal year 25 budget resolution, I believe that this creates a September 30th, 2025 deadline for action, in the sense that once you roll into fiscal year 26 for the federal government, I think the legislation would likely lose its privilege status in the Senate. We've never tested this. This is just the hypothesis, but I've talked to some people about it, and this is sort of the general perspective on Capitol Hill, that September 30th, 2025 kind of becomes a deadline for action, at least as it relates to the Senate, where the protection matters. But there is this dynamic of the debt limit. So the House budget resolution contemplated including, as a part of the one big beautiful bill, a $4 trillion increase in the statutory debt limit. That would accelerate the deadline if they, in fact, if that is in the final version, which has not yet been decided. But if they put that in the final version and they say, this is how we're going to deal with the debt limit, then the deadline for action becomes whatever the Treasury Secretary finally establishes as the X date, the deadline beyond which the federal government would default on its debt and trigger all sorts of economic calamity, and that's being gentle. The tricky part about the X date is we won't know the answer to that question. We typically don't know, let's put it this way, until a couple weeks, maybe a month before the X date is established. That's, you get very close to it before you know with certainty when the deadline is. So the first big thing that will happen is April 15th, estimated tax payment, not estimated, everyone owes on April 15th. That's like a great day for the government in terms of revenue collection. And we'll see then late April, did we collect enough to make it to June 15th, which is the next individual estimated payment deadline. If we did, the Secretary will let us know, we'll make it to June 15th. And on June 15th, we'll get more payments and we'll figure out, is this a July, August, kind of how far can we get? But it is possible that the April 15th collections are insufficient to get to June 15th. And then this becomes sort of a Memorial Day-ish timed event. That would put a lot of pressure on the tax bill. So the debt limit is a real wild card in this, because we don't know what the X date is as we sit here today. We might not know until a couple weeks, maybe a month before before it's established what it is. And Congress, they're going to make some tough calls here, not just on tax, a whole bunch of spending cuts that are going to be, I think, the real kind of friction point in the negotiation. And I worry about debt limit being included simply because it adds this level of uncertainty to the timing. And then that becomes the dominant feature. Like, the tax bill is very important, don't get me wrong. But all the taxes going up at the end of the year would be a trivial economic consequence relative to defaulting on our debt. So it adds up, it really raises the stakes, like order of magnitude raises the stakes for this transaction.
Interesting. Great. Rohit, thank you so much for your thoughts on this. Appreciate it.
Sure.
And for our viewers, don't miss any of the insight from our policy team. And just in case you missed last week's episodes, links are included in this episode's description.
And coming up this week, more on tariffs and what it means for your planning and larger business. Thank you as always for spending this time with us, and have a great week. Take care.